Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
Okay, I just want to welcome those who are watching on the Tevi Online. Welcome to Beyond the Matrix. We're getting ready to start the show in just about a minute, so you guys stand by. I've got Jerry Gordon here. Wave your hand, Jerry, so they can know the difference between you and I. I don't know how we could be mistaken as brothers from another mother maybe some other time, but right now we appreciate you guys coming on. Make sure you leave us a comment below and subscribe for the notification when we post a new show. Okay, stand by. Get in the queue in 3, 2. Don't give me your Corona, man. What's up with that? 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
What a great day to be alive in this pandemic. No, I don't want to sound crash, but look, life is good, Jerry. We have if there's ever a time to have a pandemic, it would be in this century where we know how to respond to it in a proper way. We're going to have some reflections in just a few minutes about 1918 and the big mistakes that were made back then. And it appears that the current administration has developed out a plan that seems to be proportionate to the response that we need to keep down this deadly virus from spreading. We have a very special guest coming on board. Could you tell our listeners about Tevi Troy?
Tevi Troy is a former deputy secretary at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and he was also essentially a presidential aide dealing with domestic policies, bioterrorism, and emergency planning. So subsequently, he's become a noted presidential historian and author. And one of his books in particular, called Should We Wake Up the President, is really a cookbook on the question of individual resilience and planning in the case of disasters such as the coronavirus pandemic that we're facing at the present time. He also has a new book out called Fight House, which is very interesting, about the clashes between presidents and their senior aides over issues, not the least of which was the effort on the part of Harry Truman to essentially declare U.S. recognition of the embryonic state of Israel over the objections of World War II,
right?
Marshall.
And what we find out is that pain went really deep with that president after the discussion and dialogue. Well, guys, don't go away. I mean, really want you to stick around, and thank you for watching us on the Tevi Online and also joining us here on Beyond the Matrix. We'll be right back with Tevi Troy and Jerry Gordon in just a moment. Okay.
Tevi, were you at HHS when the first bioterrorism initiative was proposed to stockpile certain drugs?
I think you're talking about BioShield.
Yeah, BioShield.
I was at the White House at the time, not at HHS.
So who was the spark plug for that?
Oh, it's a good question. The Vice President's office, I think, pushed it pretty heavily back then.
Yep.
And Tommy Thompson was the secretary at HHS. There's a guy named Stu Simonson, who was his preparedness person, who's now at WHO.
Yep.
He was a big guy behind BioShield.
I'm still trying to figure out what is going on with my software here, so stand by just a second.
Yeah, there were a bunch of people in the Bush administration who were very interested in this issue of preparedness. You know, Bush read that book, Great Influenza by John Barry.
Yes.
And that was influential in his thinking. There was a guy named Bob Bob Kadlec, who was at the National Security Council
Yep.
in those years. He's now the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness at HHS. And he started a bioterror commission, a bipartisan bioterror commission that I'm on, along with Senator Lieberman and Governor Ridge.
Yeah, Joe Lieberman and I go back personally since I was a resident of Connecticut and worked for him during the 2006 campaign. And also during, let's see now, that was informal, but also during the last debacle, during the financial thing in 2008.
Yeah, no, he's a great guy, and we spent some time together on that bioterror commission.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to figure it. Schmooze amongst yourself for a little bit longer until I check this audio out. Go ahead.
News Talk Radio.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, you guys give me a mic test.
How is the quick brown fox?
Okay, Tevi.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, that
6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay, that might work. For some reason, the audio. Oh, Jiminy Cricket. Hold on. The audio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Okay, so here we go. We're starting.
Welcome back. The Matrix.
What's moving in the bottom right-hand corner? Is that a dog or a cat?
Welcome back to Beyond
my
the
dog.
Matrix, here on Israel News Talk. Welcome back.
Half the time,
The Matrix.
half the time during the show, you'll see him looking that way. It's kind of like I usually shut them out, but they somehow get through the door. But anyway,
That's fine.
uh,
I just
That-
can't get enough of a glimpse to identify the.
yeah, it's funny because he'd be sitting there and he's looking back that way or sniffing around and walks out the room.
Small dog.
Okay,
Right?
say again.
It's a small dog, right?
Oh yeah, it's a little terrier, rat terrier, who thinks everybody that comes to this house is his best friend.
Oh, that's-
It's like everybody's like. I've seen construction workers leave from doing the work, and she'll sit in the window and whine for hours.
Oh.
Like, oh, where you at? Okay, here we go. In 3, 2, and 1.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
I'm Rod Bryant, along with my amazing co-host, Jerry Gordon. And we are with a very distinguished guest that we're very excited about having on the show. We've told you a little bit about him in the intro, but is Tevi Troy. And he's written a very interesting book, which his title is a little different than what the content is. And as we go into it, could you just first give us an explanation of the title, why title it that way, and what was the actual, the meat of the book itself, Troy?
Well, the book is called Shall We Wake the President? And it's 200 years of disaster management from the Oval Office. And so the book is about how presidents have responded to disasters. But I didn't want to write this book just about presidents and what they've done, although that's part of it, and I think part of the fascinating part. But I also thought if you're reading all these stories about disasters, you start to wonder, well, what should I do when there's a disaster? And so I have a lot in there about personal preparedness, what you as an individual should do. Because one point I make in the book is that the president's not coming to your house. The president's not going to give you the food you need or rescue you from marauders. You need to prepare yourself. So while I think the president plays an important role in responding in a national way, in an individual basis, you have to be prepared. So I'm skeptical of the government's ability to solve your personal problems, even as I think good crisis management can help the nation get through a difficult time.
Very good explanation, Jerry. Go ahead.
Tevi, you're a former Bush White House aide, deputy secretary at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, terrorism and health emergency planning expert. And, as we just heard, a noted presidential historian. Serious is the coronavirus threat here in the U.S. versus Europe and in the Middle East with Iran versus Israel.
Look, what we're seeing is that the virus can hit different countries in different ways, but also different countries are responding in different ways. So I know Israel is of interest to the listeners here. Israel is a small country with controllable borders, with a history of responding to problems in a national way, and a nation that is used to being pressed into service, right? They have a mandatory conscription. They are able to address these things in a way that a country that's as large as the U.S., as diverse as the U.S., with much more porous borders and much more diversity, not just in terms of ethnicities and races and religions, but also in terms of population density, right? The population density in New York, Chicago, LA, Seattle, San Francisco, which are the places where this seems to be hitting worst so far, although not yet Chicago, but it may come to that. But you look at then Nebraska and Idaho, and the population density is much lower, and you may just have need for different approaches. So I'm looking at this as it is a global phenomenon, but it's hitting different parts of the globe differently.
In some way, this whatever call it, pandemic, or this incident that's taking place right now is a true test of a country's mettle to be able to respond to something like this. As a former emergency manager, one of the big things that hits you the hardest is realizing the magnitude of the possibilities of impact on communities, and how limited, when you look at the large scope of what could happen, how difficult it is for entities, governments, agencies, local, whether federal or national agencies, can actually respond to the calamity that can happen at a certain level. And that's why your book is so incredibly important right now. Why are you skeptical of the government's ability to help an individual? Kind of put that in context for us.
So I'm skeptical only because there's a limited number of people who work for the government, and there's 328 million Americans. I mean, if your basement is flooding, if you are out of food, if people are coming to threaten you, you cannot necessarily count on the government being there in real time. We've heard disturbing reports already of some crime increases in urban areas, of urban police forces saying we're not going to address property crimes. This is exactly the kind of stuff I'm warning about in the book. And also, if there's not enough food, then the government's not going to show up at your house with food. If there's some kind of medicine you need, except in rare circumstances, the government's not going to bring the food, the medicine to your house. So that's why in the book I talk about personal preparedness strategies, what you should be doing to make sure that you are ready if something bad happens. And again, that doesn't mean the government doesn't have a role to play, and I think the government can play that role well. But the role is not coming to your house and solving your personal problems. And that's what I think people have to get their heads around. The other thing is that this helps the government out, because if people are individually prepared, and I know, Rod, this is something that you've dealt with, if people themselves are ready, then they tax the resources of the first responders less so. And so the first responders can deal with more emergency and more urgent circumstances than the more minor things that you can handle on your own.
One of the concepts that I help to hammer out, which is in some ways in many small communities across this country and in some other countries, we started a thing called a community response task force, which was actually a grassroots, what I call a trifecta of care, bringing NGOs, governmental organizations, and nonprofits together in a preparing matrix. So if an incident took place, we knew who we could call on. We knew our resources already. And the prime example is the last major hurricane that we had in the state of Texas was responded very well by the community that stayed organized, that listened to the radio, that responded to needs that we had in the community. And this is exactly what you're talking about, correct?
Yeah, I think you're talking about Hurricane Harvey, right?
Correct.
Because in Harvey, that was actually a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because there were two things going on with Harvey. Number one is individuals took care of themselves.
Right.
You had volunteer organizations in the local community helping out, but you also had people, thanks to the glories of the interstate highway system, coming and descending on Houston to bring aid and assistance, which was a great and beautiful thing.
Right.
The federal government was also pretty good. They learned some of the lessons from Katrina, and they did a much better job of responding, seeing where the needs were, using social media, just being aware in real time in a way that they were not 10 years before. However, just a month later, you had the hurricane in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria.
Correct.
And the government did not do as well, and the people there did not have the same culture of self improvement, I guess. I mean, I'm not sure exactly.
Self-reliance, yes.
Self-reliance, perhaps. Yeah. There's much more of a sense of reliance on the government, and the government didn't have an interstate highway system. And every load, every pallet of supplies that came from the mainland came at huge cost, and there were logistical nightmares. And then once you got it there, it was much harder to distribute on this very difficult terrain of an island. And so the government had a tougher time distributing the resources, but also the folks there were less able to do the same preparedness steps, or had not done the same preparedness steps.
Right.
And you couldn't have somebody from Dallas driving to Puerto Rico.
No, absolutely.
From Dallas to Houston to help out. The American people wanted to help in that situation. They just had no capacity to do so.
Absolutely. Jerry, go ahead.
There's been panic buying in this current, especially of toilet paper and other staple goods. Behind this behavior, and what would you recommend people include in their individual stockpiles?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would urge people to get Shall We Wake the President, which is now available in paperback, and you can even get it at Costco while you're buying your toilet paper or everything else, because I have specific lists. But some of the things I talk about are having a supply of water on hand, having food to last for a week on hand. I don't think you should have food for a month or a year, because if we need it for a year, we've got much bigger problems. But also just have some basic staple of medications, first aid kit. I mean, there are things that are relatively simple, not that expensive, that everybody can realistically have in their house, even if it's a small apartment or a large mansion. And I think those things would help people get through these difficult times.
You explained in the sort of the intro of the show when we were talking before we started about why people bought toilet paper. Now, this was a mystery to me until you brought up an idea that I've never thought of. Could you explain to the audience what we're talking about?
Yeah, I actually got this from a friend of mine who's a big shot Hollywood producer type, and he was telling me that he has a hoard of toilet paper. This is long before this current virus, in his basement. And I said, why? He said, well, first of all, it's an absolute necessity. Everybody needs it. Second of all, it's not perishable, right? It doesn't go away. It stays good forever. And third of all, if let's say the whole society collapses and we no longer, the dollar is not backed by the United States government, it's a form of barter, right? It's a form of currency. You can always use it to exchange for other items. So he had a whole bunch of toilet paper in his basement, and I hope he's enjoying it right now as we speak.
I hope he is, and maybe he's benefiting from the bartering. But I've never actually thought about that. But it is interesting you say that, because part of the whole idea of being self-reliant is being able to be sharp enough to realize, there might be some things that you can collect and barter. For example, we have people in our community that have their own private gardens, and already people are starting to swap out things that are in their gardens for that are overrun, that they can trade off for stuff. So that's a brilliant idea. Why has the Obama and Trump administration abandoned the Global Health Security Threats Office in the National Security Council? And we only have about a minute, and then we're going to have to come back.
Yeah, there was a good op-ed in the Washington Post by somebody who now heads that role at National Security Council. I mean, I think this thing is a little overblown. The United States government still has people who are designed to work on pandemics and global health security.
Right.
Just there were some shuffling of deck chairs within the National Security Council that put them within a different office. And I'm not sure it was a terrible thing. For a bioterror commission that I participate in, we said that biosecurity is such a big deal, we should make it under the auspices of the vice president. Again,
right.
Been a bureaucratic shuffle. That was not adopted, but now we've seen the vice president is in charge of the task force.
Absolutely. We're going to explain that a little bit more after the break. Guys, don't go away. Very interesting interview. We'll be right back after these very important messages.
Good flow, guys.
Good flow. Good job. Good job.
Yep.
Sometimes I have trouble hearing Jerry.
Jerry, I'm going to need you to get up close to your microphone, because what's happening is the whatever white noise is coming over Tivi's phone is canceling you out when you talk.
How about now?
Yeah, I think that'll work. Yes.
Okay.
So stand by. We're still waiting. Yeah, this book is perfect timing to really get this out to the public. This is great.
Yeah, the funny thing is I have a new book out called Fight House. It just came out in hardcover, and maybe I should have switched the books. That would come out in 2016 and this one.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
But you never know.
Okay, so when we come back from the break, we'll get into the question about tabletop simulations. By the way, the Israelis do for things like nuclear threats and attacks and bio attacks.
Also, before we get through the last segment, if you could kind of go down through what we call a quick bucket list of things that people need to think about, even now, even though we're quite into the whole incident, what should they be thinking about?
Okay.
And how should they be responding? So stand by. We're still waiting.
I will give you an interesting benchmark, Tevi. During the 1918 flu epidemic, the stock market crashed by 40%. We're less than 5% away from that benchmark.
Oh.
Okay, here we go. Stand by. In 3, 2, and 1.
Act Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Thank you for sticking around from the break. I'm Rod Bryant, along with Jerry Gordon, my co-host and producer. And we have Tevi Troy with us, talking about a very interesting book that he has written back in, I guess, 2016 is when it first came out, but now it's out in Costco and Amazon and just about anywhere you can find it. I would say a book very worth reading, even though we're smack dab in the middle of this sort of pandemic issue that's going on. Let's go back to this whole idea that I'd asked a question before the break about the Trump administration seemingly to abandon the sort of norm in the World Health Organization, et cetera. And you were saying the way they've reorganized is something they've been talking about for a while, correct?
Yeah, this stuff has changed a bunch. You know, there was no Homeland Security Council within the White House until after 9/11. President Bush created that.
Right.
Then Obama took the Homeland Security Council and he folded it within the National Security Council. And now they had that pandemic office. Now it's folded under a different office in the National Security Council. So, I mean, this kind of bureaucratic deck chair rearranging, I don't think really changes the fundamental nature of the problem we face or our capacity to deal with it. The question is, why do we not have a countermeasure for coronavirus? In that book you talk about, in my book, Shall We Wake the President, came out in 2016. It's just out in paperback now. But in 2016, I was raising this issue of coronavirus, and I said, we have vaccines and countermeasures and antivirals for flu, but we do not have them for coronavirus, and we need to develop them. And I don't know why the U.S. government hasn't moved faster on that. So I don't think it's a matter of an office within the National Security Council. I think that there are larger issues at play in terms of prioritizing development of countermeasures.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. It's not intentional ignoring an issue. But on the other hand, we understand why Israel is at the forefront of their development in coronaviruses, because they've been working on an issue for a long time, with trying to figure out a way to find a proper response to it. And it looks like that they were actually ahead of the curve when this thing sort of broke out. So, which is very encouraging. Jerry, you had something you want to follow up with. Go ahead.
Tevi, you're a proponent of so-called tabletop simulations as an aid in planning for public health emergencies like the current pandemic. A reflection of your experience of a member of a White House Blue Ribbon panel on bioterror.
Yeah, so I am a member of that panel. It's a bipartisan commission, which I think is important. It's got Governor Ridge, former Pennsylvania governor and former head of the Department of Homeland Security, and Senator Lieberman, Democrat, former senator. And it's a whole bunch of bipartisan luminaries from previous administrations who all have experience in this area. And we all agree on the importance of tabletop exercises and simulations. You can't just go into these high pressure government environments and then be thrown into a crisis and told to deal. You have to know what each agency's role is, what their capabilities are, what are some of the legal pitfalls that you might encounter. So I think it's, so tabletop exercises, they will throw a simulation at you, they'll say, and I remember this one specifically that we faced is, and it's old enough now that I can say it without harming national security, but we get hit by a dirty bomb in the Southwest and a mysterious illness comes around in the Midwest. What do you do? And then one thing that I remember really was a problem that we did not anticipate before we started the simulation, but something we started thinking about after, was the degree to which hospitals were overrun. And not just overrun with people who are sick, but overrun with what's known as the worried well. People who think they might have a symptom because they heard something on TV, or they're just they want to check it out to be sure. And worried well is something that we've been seeing as a challenge in coronavirus. People who think that they have a problem are going to the hospital, which is the wrong thing to do, because if they don't have it, it could expose them to it, and if they do have it, they could be exposing others to it. So I think these simulations are extremely helpful.
One of the things I want to follow up on that, Jerry, real quick, and then I'll toss it back over to you. One of the things that is really important, you talk about the tabletop exercises done on a government level, a federal, state, local level. Many countries do the same thing. Israel does the same thing. Is now during this kind of a situation where every human being is at some level learning something new about their response and how they're going to respond. Now would be a time for individuals to take notes on what happened, how did it happen, how did I respond, what do I need to do next time around to be better prepared. It's important for individuals to practice sort of what I call a mental tabletop exercise to go, okay, if this happens again, what am I going to do different? Could you address that for just a moment?
I think that's a really good point. I think you do need to not only have whatever plans you had from my book or whatever your experiences previously, but think about this now. What do you wish you had known or had acquired before this crisis took place? So, for example, beyond wishing that you had sold your stocks 3 weeks ago, you know what I mean? So there are things that you can think about, like, maybe I didn't have enough water. Maybe I do need something else for home protection. Maybe I should have a more secure lock. Maybe I should make sure that the kids have their vaccinations up to date. I should have my first aid kit ready. So there are all kinds of things that you can think about what's going on in this current crisis that you should be prepared for. One thing that's interesting in this crisis is the supermarkets are still open. You can go to the supermarket and get food with the exception of a few products. We talked a little bit about toilet paper. You can get pretty much everything you need at the supermarket, which is unlike how it could be in a real major disaster, like when there was a hurricane in Houston. You couldn't get to the supermarkets. It doesn't last as long. But so this crisis is a little different, but every crisis is different, and you can't exactly predict what's going to happen. So that's why updating that mental checklist is an important, constant thing to do.
You said something very important. Every incident is different. You can't prepare for every possibility, but any person can be generally prepared to respond by knowing what they will do if something happens. And that's the important part to remember. There's no way to have enough stockpile of everything that you possibly could want and need for every circumstance. But for sure, you can program your response to it, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Look, even if you live even in a Costco, you wouldn't have everything you want forever.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why people go out to the supermarket to get the stuff they need. I mean, these are not strategies for you to live forever. These are strategies for you to get through a brief period when the government may not be able to help you as an individual until the system reasserts itself, and then the brilliance of markets allow the supermarkets to replenish and you to be able to access them. So again, these are short-term strategies. The long-term strategy, then we start talking about knowing how to use a bow and arrow and fishing and being able to start from scratch.
Right.
Not at that point.
There is also another factor that precludes people from actually being prepared, and I call it the sort of being the overwhelming reality of what they need to do, and they get a bigger picture as it's too overwhelming for me to try to prepare for everything. And I try to explain to them, no, just keep it simple. You can survive, literally survive off of beans and rice. Just go buy some beans and rice and store it and eat off of it. It's something simple. And then I've heard people go, oh, well, I couldn't imagine eating beans and rice for weeks on end. Well, better than dying.
That's true.
It's like
About what our ancestors say, you know?
Yeah, think practical about the whole thing. Jerry, go ahead.
Let's go to your rogues list of worst presidents in handling emergencies of current nature. Ironically, who's at the top of the list?
Well, it's clearly Woodrow Wilson, who just bollocksed up the 1918 flu response completely. First of all, there was a propaganda arm of the United States government that he had helped design, led by a guy named George Creel. And this propaganda arm was designed to help fight World War I by suppressing any dissent or news about bad stuff. So it kind of forced down any discussion of the 1918 flu that raged and killed 675,000 Americans. So people didn't have open conversations about it, like we are having in the newspapers today. But the second thing is that there were troop transports that were sending U.S. troops to Europe to fight World War I. And those troop transports were spreading the disease among the U.S. military personnel and among the people of Europe. And Wilson's personal doctor urged him to stop those troop transports. And they had a showdown in the White House where the equivalent of the Army Chief of Staff said, no, we cannot stop these troop transports. They are too urgent. The war is going on. It was only 1 month before the war ended. But Wilson went along with the Army Chief of Staff. He continued the troop transports. And out of the 116,000 U.S. military personnel who died in World War I, 43,000 of them died from the flu.
Also, you can contrast that to what happened in the Midwest where I think it was Missouri, if I'm not mistaken.
St. Louis versus Philadelphia.
Yeah. That's quite a contrast, wasn't it?
Yeah, St. Louis instituted social distancing, kind of like we're seeing today. Said, no large church services, no parades, no movie theaters, and Philadelphia failed to do so. They waited 2 crucial weeks, and they let people get together. They had certain parades take place, and the death rate in St. Louis was 1/5 that of Philadelphia.
That is amazing. We only have probably a minute left. You talked about the worst. Can you give me what you think is the best response, and then we'll come up and wrap it up in the next segment?
Well, the best response is preventing a problem before it happens. So I give a lot of credit to Bill Clinton for how he handled the kind of the millennium thing, the fact that we thought all the computers were going to go down. So he handled that, the millennium bug, pretty well. But I also give George W. Bush good marks for how he handled 9/11. And a great story I'll say really quickly, I know we're short on time, is Richard Nixon. In 1969, there was a hurricane, and he asked what was wrong in the response. He sent Vice President Agnew back, and Agnew said that people didn't know the severity level of the hurricane, and Nixon directed the bureaucracy to solve that problem, and that's how we came up with this categorization of hurricanes, category 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 that we know today.
Wow, that's a good summation of it. Look, there's a good, bad, and ugly just about in every disaster that takes place, and there are going to be mistakes and variables happen. But one of the things for sure that I want to make sure that we get to you in the audience is that you can be prepared, and you can still be prepared. Even though you've come into this thing without any paradigm of what to do, you're learning really quick. People learn real quick in emergency what to do. So we want to encourage you to go out and buy this book, Should We Wake the President? And you really won't regret buying this book. We'll be right back after these messages here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Okay. This is our final segment.
Yes, this will be our final segment.
All right. So, Tevi, you want to switch to your current book because there's a nice anecdote regarding Harry Truman versus Clark Clifford.
Oh yeah, I love the hell of that story. Happy to switch to Fight House anytime.
Yeah. So when we come back, I'll pop that to you.
Thanks.
I don't know if you've noticed that there are some threads going around. I don't know what the genesis of it is, but there's some threads going around that are people saying, this is a conspiracy to take away our liberties, don't respond, keep meeting in groups, don't, I'm just trying to figure out where that's coming from.
Crazy people.
So that's all you think it is. It's like people just trying to stir up a mess.
Yeah. Look, I also think that the relations between Trump and the Democrats don't help, and the fact that the biggest problems are in, again, Seattle, New York, LA, San Francisco, very liberal cities that are very hostile to Trump. not helpful. And if we start to see civil unrest in those cities, I just don't know what's going to happen, because I think those cities would blame Trump for everything. Trump may not send in the National Guard. The cities might say, don't send in the Trump National Guard because we don't want your, evil federal troops in there. So I think it could get real bad real fast.
Right. And I hate to say this, but if there's going to be uprising, I would put it in those places, unlike where I live or where Jerry lives. I don't think that where we live, it's a different mentality. It's just a completely different mentality. It's not about conservative or liberal. It's just completely different mentality about our region compared to, say, Northeast or the West Coast. Okay, so stand by, guys. We're coming up from the end of the break. By the way, you guys watching online, thank you so much for taking time. Like the comments on Facebook. Please leave us more comments. It's very important, so we get your feedback to find out what you think about the show. I forgot to mention it in the actual radio show itself, but I'll do that next as we're coming out. Appreciate you guys watching on the Tevi online. Okay, in 3, 2, and 1.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
I'm Rod Bryant. Thank you for sticking around from the break. Just want to remind you, we are live streaming this show on YouTube. And it's found at Netiv, N-E-T-I-V, online. That is one word, Netiv online, N-E-T-I-V, online. And you really, it'd be a great opportunity to see what's going on in the background. You actually get exclusive in the break information that is exchanged between our guest and the host. And we also want to get your feedback. So make sure you go to YouTube, Netiv, N-E-T-I-V, online, watch the show. And we really appreciate it. It comes on at the same time as the regular show each week on Israel News Talk Radio. Jerry, let me bump it over to you, and let's get rolling.
Your latest book, Fight House, discusses the history of conflicts between presidents and top aides. One interesting example you cite is between President Harry Truman, and Chief of Staff Mark Clifford. Could you tell us what happened for the recognition of the State of Israel?
Well, so this dates back to 1948 when the U.S. had not recognized Israel. Israel was just a new country. And this is before that it was seen as axiomatic that the U.S. and Israel were close allies. So the U.S. has to make this decision about whether to recognize Israel. Truman is the president trying to make this decision. And Secretary of State Marshall is adamantly opposed to recognizing Israel. And this guy was a hero of World War II, and he's a person who Truman revered more than anyone else in public life. And he's saying, don't recognize Israel. But Truman knows he has to hear both sides of the story, so he deputizes Clark Clifford, who at the time was a junior White House aide, to make the case for Israel. And Clifford, while he's young, is a smart lawyer, and he does a legal brief in favor of recognizing Israel, makes the case in the White House in front of Truman and Marshall. Marshall loses the argument. The U.S. recognizes Israel. Marshall is so mad at losing the argument that he never again speaks to Clifford or utters his name for the rest of his life. Talk about holding a grudge.
Any examples from the Bush administration that you lived through and currently with Mr. Trump?
Yeah, so I did serve in the Bush administration, and I would say I was somewhat pleasantly surprised in the Bush administration at the relative comity in terms of people getting along on the domestic policy staff. But on the foreign policy staff, we had a big mess. You had Colin Powell at State Department and Don Rumsfeld at Defense and Dick Cheney as Vice President, all of them very big personalities, people with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge who thought that they knew the right way to go. Condoleezza Rice was the National Security Advisor. She was junior to all of them. And I argue in the book in Fight House that she was really incapable of managing the conflict among these three 800-pound gorillas. And I think that led to a lot of dysfunction and a lot of problems that didn't need to be there. And what I argue in the book in Fight House is that the worst thing that any staffer did in all of the internecine fights that I talk about throughout the history of Fight House happened in the Bush administration. When Dick Armitage leaks the name of Valerie Plame, who's a covert operative, to the press, there's an investigation of who did it. Armitage knows he did it, but doesn't step up and tell the world, hey, I did it. He allows the investigation to continue, putting his own colleagues in legal jeopardy. And eventually Scooter Libby is convicted of perjury related to the investigation, even though he did not do the underlying leak itself. And Armitage's silence, I think, was unconscionable at a time when these are your colleagues. And the whole point of Fight House is these are people who are supposedly on the same team. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. These are people who are all serving the same president, serving the same administration. They're supposed to be to some degree on the same side. And that is not what I found in this history in Fight House.
So your book is going to basically reveal that these kinds of issues have existed in all presidential administrations. And if we could probably say it would be the same in Israel and other different countries, you're just going to have this kind of stuff, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I wrote a piece in Tablet magazine recently about fighting in Israeli politics in the administrations between Golda Meir and Abba Eban. Golda Meir hated Abba Eban. And when she was told that he speaks 5 languages, she said, yes, but so does the waiter at the King David Hotel. Maybe you could link on the show notes to this article in Tablet that I wrote. But yeah, there's all sorts of fighting in a variety of administrations. And, in some ways it's the nature of politics. But I also argue in Fight House that there are things presidents can do to control if they so choose.
Yeah, that's one of the big fine arts of diplomacy as a president, is being able to keep control of that kind of stuff. Look, we only have about 5 minutes in the show. I do want to get back to the particular, challenges to the Jewish community. But I first want you to kind of go through a quick, not a bucket list, but a quick thing that you could remind people that they should and could do right now to continue to be prepared.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that while we are in the midst of a crisis, it's not the kind of crisis that paralyzes you, that doesn't let you leave the house unless you're self-quarantined. And so you can still go out and buy the things you need. You should think about what happens if the shutdowns get more serious, if you think you can't get to the supermarket for a week. What kind of non-perishable foods can you buy that will keep you and your family going for a while? Do you think you have enough water? Maybe you should buy some batteries in case the power goes out. We had the power go out for about 15 minutes on Friday. I was glad it was only 15 minutes, but I didn't know that it would only be 15 minutes. Maybe you should have some candles around. So there are things that you should have around the house now, and it's not too late to get those things just in case this thing gets worse.
Absolutely. Very good idea. Look, you wrote a Wall Street Journal opinion column on the difficulties of organizing a minyan. And for our non-Jewish listeners, a minyan is a group of 10 men to gather together for prayer, to say Kaddish, for example, with the passing of your mother in blessed memory amid this pandemic, and may her memory always be blessed. Would you tell our listeners about the difficulties you encountered and the novel ways in which the Jewish community has made arrangements for this kind of thing?
Yeah, so this has been a very challenging time for me. My mother died a few weeks ago, and in the Jewish response to death is a communal one. You're supposed to get together at the funeral. You get together for a week at the Shiva house. There are prayers you're supposed to say every day, 3 times a day, called the Kaddish prayer, and you can only say that with a prayer quorum or a minyan of 10 men. And now we've been told by the government and also by our rabbis that we should not be getting together. Mm-hmm. So before the stricter rules went into place, when just the synagogues closed, but we were allowed to congregate in smaller groups, I had a couple of outdoor minyans or prayer quorums where I was able to say these prayers for my mother. And after a few days of this, when the strict rules went into place, I, of course, completely adhere to the rules. And I think we should, as a Jewish community, show that we are completely supportive of the government in these difficult times. So I do support these rules, but before the rules went into place, I kind of had a recognition that this was going to be one of the last times I could say Kaddish for my mother. And it was a very challenging period, but my rabbi has walked me through it. He said it is more important to be following the rules and preventing the spread of this disease and saving lives than to say Kaddish, which is a custom but not a law. And then on top of it, he said that I should do some Jewish learning with each prayer service that I do individually in order to kind of honor the soul of my mother.
Absolutely. You know, it's really interesting that there's a whole halakhic discussion about violating one halakha for to save the life of a fellow Jew or to save your own life, et cetera, et cetera. And these come into play. And thank God we have responsible rabbis that are able to analyze the situation and give a very reasonable response to this. Jerry, you have a question you want to ask? We have about 3 minutes left.
You have a pretty illustrious family. In fact, a gentleman who I've been in contact with on occasion, his name is Gil Troy. Who else in the family is of note?
So my brother Gil is a noted author, has written over 10 books, and he's a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, a famous historian. And I have a brother, Dan Troy, who is a lawyer. He was the chief counsel at the FDA, and I learned a lot of the stuff I know about the health law and food and drug policies through him. So my mother of blessed memory encouraged us all to read. I see that you've got that well-appointed bookshelf in your house. In my house, my mother's house, and my father's house, obviously my father's still with us, there were books everywhere, books from floor to ceiling in every room, and they encouraged us to read. And I tell other parents that that's what you should do. Encourage your children to read, and they can kind of spread their wings and do great things.
We have truly appreciated you coming onto the show, and I just want to make a little quick note to our listeners. Our show is also you can also view the show live stream on YouTube, on netiv.net, or I'm sorry, NETIV online, one solid word, Netiv online. Also, there's a couple of anecdotal things that I would like to bring up and maybe get your comment on before we leave. Is I am seeing sort of a new emergence of Jewish teaching, fresh new ideas about communal meetings online using different platforms. Are you seeing the same thing?
There has been some discussion of these communal prayer quorums. I think there's, as with many things, rabbinical disagreement about whether they can do what they need to do in terms of allowing someone to say the Kaddish prayer. I think it is pretty clear that you can get together and pray together. It's just not clear whether you can say the Kaddish without the quorum in person of the 10 men. And so if that works for people, I urge them to do it. I think the loss of community is a very big challenge in these difficult times. And, I feel for the rabbis, and I've said this to my rabbi multiple times. I really feel for you because his whole job is tending to this flock, to this community, and they all come together. In my synagogue, we have 400 people every week at least on Saturdays, but every day there's probably hundreds of people in the synagogue at the three prayer services, and suddenly you're devoid of that, and it's got to be very jarring. So
it's got to be tough.
Often the rabbis reach out to you to try and help, but you should think about your rabbis and see how they're facing this difficult time.
Another thing would help is if you're technically proficient enough to help your rabbi, show him how he can do FaceTime calls or whatever, face-to-face meetings on the computer, individual. He can do those sort of pastoral duties right there online. It'd be very easy to do. Tevi, thank you so much for coming on. I hope this is not the last time that we have you on talking about these subject matters. You've been listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio, and we will see you the same time next week here on Israel News Talk Radio. Shalom.
Shalom.
Okay. Excellent. Tevi, great interview, bro. Man, that was beautiful.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. You guys are fun. I'd love to see you next time I'm in Houston. Jerry, where do you live?
I live in a place called Pensacola, Florida. It's as far west as you can get, and we're in a different time zone.
Okay.
So when you come back to Houston, Tevi, let me know. I'd love to sit down with you.
Okay, we'll go to that steakhouse.
Oh, man, my treat too, by the way, okay?
I'll pay, but it'll be fun.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tevi. Appreciate it. And we're going to we'll wrap this up, and then we'll send you the link to the show when it's posted.
Okay, so I should leave out?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks so much. Stay safe, everybody.
Take care. You too.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. That was very, very smooth.
That's because he's done it before.
Well, he's a professional. Yeah.
Yeah. But he also has a certain open, approachable manner in terms of discussing this stuff without being, an authoritarian figure who says basically,
"Oh, this has got to be this way, that way." Yeah. Well, another thing that makes him that way is he's actually been on the inside of a lot of this planning, and so he knows what the reality is on the ground. It's like it's completely different. That's what people don't understand. When I hear people talk about these grand conspiracies of what government's doing and not doing, it's like, no, they're not that smart. It's such a bureaucracy. It takes a lot of work to just pull together what they can cobble together, Okay, so that's saved. We've got 1, 2, 3 in the can.